She arrived with nothing but a name no one would speak kindly, a past no one would hear fairly, and a winter closing in like a jaw. What happened next in the frozen square of Ashwood Ridge on the porch of a man the town had already buried would prove that the most dangerous thing in any community is not a guilty woman. It is an innocent one who finally stops being afraid. Stay with this story, because by the end, you will understand that sometimes the only way to survive a town that has already decided who you are is to stop asking for their permission to exist. The stagecoach came in from the east just after noon, rolling down the long throat of the main road with all the ceremony of a funeral cart. The sky above Ashwood Ridge was the color of old pewter hammered flat, offering no warmth and no promise. The elm trees that lined the edge of town had surrendered their last leaves weeks ago, and their bare branches clawed upward like the hands of people who had stopped praying but had not yet learned to stop reaching. The first snow had not yet fallen, but its intention was everywhere, in the particular stillness of the air, in the way the mud along the road had stiffened into pale cracked ridges, in the collective exhale of the town itself, braced and waiting. Clara Voss stepped down from the coach with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned through hard experience that the ground beneath her feet could not always be trusted. She was 31 years old. She did not look broken. That was the first thing anyone who later tried to describe her would say with a faint note of surprise, as though brokenness was the only reasonable condition for a woman in her circumstances. She was slight, yes. Her gray traveling coat, once well made, had been let out at the seams and taken in again, its history written in the faint ghost lines of old stitching. Her dark hair was pinned back with the efficiency of someone who had no time for vanity and no patience for pretense. Her face was not beautiful in the way that town portraits were beautiful. It was something more useful than that. It was composed. Her jaw was set. Her eyes, a deep and steady brown, moved across the unfamiliar buildings of Ashwood Ridge with the measured attention of someone cataloging exits. She carried a single valise worn at the corners, the leather handle wrapped with a strip of wool to prevent blisters. It contained in its entirety the sum of her portable life: 2 changes of linen, a winter shawl, a small tin of dried herbs, a wooden-handled hairbrush with several teeth missing. A Bible not for devotion, but because it had been her mother's, and her mother was the last person in the world who had looked at her without calculation. She did not know Ashwood Ridge. She had never been west of the river before the letter arrived. The letter had been clinical in its warmth, composed in the careful handwriting of a man communicating through an intermediary, as was the custom. His name was Edmund Fitch. He was a merchant of some standing. He required a wife of steady character and domestic competence. She had been described to him through the agency as a widow of good health and quiet disposition. He had agreed to consider her. That was all. That was enough. It was in the brutal arithmetic of her life more than she had. She had been traveling for 9 days. She set her valise down on the frozen ground, pressed one hand briefly to the small of her back, and straightened to her full height. Around her the town moved and breathed and watched. A woman in a heavy coat paused on the mercantile steps and stared openly. 2 men leaning against a post outside the feed store went quiet. A child tugged at its mother's sleeve and whispered something. The mother did not answer, but her hand tightened on the child's shoulder, drawing it closer. Clara had been stared at before. She understood the grammar of public scrutiny. She let it pass over her like weather. She looked for her contact. The arrangement had specified that someone would meet the coach. A representative of Mr. Fitch, perhaps, or Mr. Fitch himself. She scanned the small crowd that had gathered with the idle curiosity that any arriving coach produced in a town with little other entertainment. She did not see anyone holding a card with her name. She did not see anyone moving toward her with the purposeful welcome of recognition. What she saw moving toward her with a very different kind of purpose was Edmund Fitch himself. She knew him immediately from the physical description in the correspondence. Stocky, silver-haired, prosperous, in the way that certain men wore prosperity, like armor, as if accumulated wealth were a form of moral achievement. He was 50 or thereabouts, with the ruddy complexion of a man who ate well and drank just enough to feel entitled. He was not walking with the measured courtesy of a man approaching a future wife. He was walking with the stiff, forward-leaning aggression of a man approaching a problem he intended to solve publicly. Behind him, because she only noticed it in retrospect, was a small cluster of town figures. The pastor, gaunt and long-faced, his collar very white against the gray day. Two men who wore the particular expression of civic authority. The town council, she would later learn, men who had opinions about everything and accountability for nothing. And trailing at the edges, the ordinary citizens of Ashwood Ridge, drawn by the same human gravity that pulls people toward raised voices and impending spectacle. Fitch stopped 3 feet from her. He did not offer his hand. He looked at her with the deliberate, appraising contempt of a man who has already made up his mind and is now simply performing his conclusion for an audience. "You are Clara Voss," he said. It was not a question. "I am, she said. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded letter. Even from where she stood, she could see that it was not from the agency. The paper was different, thicker, official, in a way that made the fine hairs on her arms rise despite her coat and her composure. "I received this," he said, 3 days ago, from Millhaven." Millhaven, the town she had come from, the town where Robert Voss had lived and drunk and raged and finally died on a dark road on a horse he should not have been riding. The town where his family still lived with their money and their lawyers and their bottomless need to put the blame for their son's failings somewhere that was not their son. She kept her face still. She was very practiced at keeping her face still. Fitch unfolded the letter with a kind of theatrical slowness that told her he had rehearsed this, or at least imagined it. He read from it not because he needed to remind himself of the contents, but because he wanted the crowd to hear. "It is our duty to inform you that the woman calling herself Clara Voss, widow of Robert Voss of Millhaven, is under serious suspicion in the matter of her husband's death. Evidence has come to light suggesting that she administered a slow poison over a period of months. She fled Millhaven before charges could be formally brought. Any man who takes her into his household does so at his own considerable risk." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a crowd that has just been given permission to feel righteous. Clara heard it. She had heard that silence before. In the Voss family parlor, when Robert's mother had stood over her with the flat certainty of a woman who had never been wrong about anything in her life. She did not speak. There was nothing useful to say, not here, not now, not in this square, with these people who were already leaning toward their conclusion. She understood this the way a person understands the weather. You did not argue with it. You survived it. Fitch was still talking. His voice had found the register that men used when they wanted to be remembered as decisive. "I will not proceed with this arrangement," he announced, and then, because he was the kind of man who required the last most wounding word, he tore the marriage contract which he had brought for exactly this purpose in half. The sound of tearing paper was very small against the open air, but it landed on her like a blow. "I will not have a black widow under my roof, or bearing my name." Black widow. The words moved through the crowd. She saw it happen, saw the phrase take root and flower in the spaces between people, saw shoulders draw back and expressions harden, and the distance between herself and everyone around her increase by several invisible inches. She had nowhere to go. She had spent the last of her savings on the coach ticket. She knew no one in this territory. Winter was coming in a matter of weeks. These were facts. She arranged them in her mind the way she had always arranged terrible facts, with the quiet, methodical care of someone who could not afford panic, and had learned that clarity was the only currency that's spent in a crisis. The crowd was pressing slightly closer, not in threat, but in that worst thing, passive, self-satisfied judgment. The pastor was murmuring something to the man beside him. A woman near the front, her coat trimmed with rabbit fur, pulled the hem of her skirt to one side as Clara stood near her, as though proximity itself were contamination. Two men exchanged a look that was almost amused. A disaster that was happening to someone else was, after all, a kind of entertainment. Clara did not cry. She would not cry, not because she was unafraid. She was terrified in the deep, structural way of a person who has been afraid for so long that fear had ceased to be an event and had become a condition, like weather, like gravity. She was afraid of the winter and the cold and the empty road and the absolute absence of anyone in the world who was on her side. But she had learned in 3 years of marriage to Robert Voss that visible fear was an invitation to those who would exploit it, to those who would pity it and then withdraw that pity, to the part of herself that wanted to collapse, that she could not under any circumstances allow to surface. She bent and picked up her valise from the frozen ground. She settled the handle in her palm, the familiar scratch of the wool wrapping against her fingers, steadying her in a way she could not have explained. She straightened her back. She turned with great deliberateness away from Edmund Fitch and his torn contract and his borrowed righteousness, and she began to walk. She did not know where she was walking to. She knew only the direction away. Away from the square and the crowd and the pastor's cold eyes. Away from the rabbit fur woman and the amused men and the child who had been pulled closer and the collective satisfied exhale of a town that had decided what she was. The road out of Ashwood Ridge ran north and then curved west through the tree line. Beyond that, she did not know. Fields, perhaps? Or nothing. It did not matter, not yet. The present task was simply to move with dignity until the square was out of sight, and then she would allow herself to think. The wind came off the northern hills and walked straight through her coat. She had not eaten since morning. Her feet inside boots that had been resoled once and needed it again had long since stopped registering the specific sensation of cold and had settled into a general numbing ache. The valise was not heavy by any reasonable measure, but her arms were tired in the way that bodies got tired when they were operating entirely on will. She counted her steps. This was something she had taught herself in the bad years when the distance from one moment to the next felt unsurvivable. One step, one more. The road was solid beneath her feet. She was walking. She was upright. She was not giving the people at her back the satisfaction of watching her stumble. She did not look back. She had walked perhaps 40 feet when she heard the footsteps. They were unhurried. That was the first thing she registered, that they were not running, not the quick pursuit of someone with bad intentions or the brisk efficiency of an official with a purpose. They were the footsteps of a man who walked at his own pace, regardless of what the situation demanded, as though he had long since stopped measuring his behavior by what others expected of it. She did not slow down. "They've made up their minds about you," said a voice behind her. It was a quiet voice, low, with the faint roughness of someone who spent more time with silence than with conversation. It was not unkind. It was also not particularly gentle. It was simply direct, the way a statement of observed fact was direct. She stopped walking. She turned around. He was taller than she had expected from the sound of his steps, which had conveyed nothing of the height or the breadth of him. He was perhaps 35, lean in the manner of someone who worked with his body, and ate when there was something to eat, and did not think much about either. His coat was plain and dark, well worn but whole, and he wore it the way a man wore something he had chosen for function and had stopped noticing. His face was angular, all planes and shadows, with dark eyes set under a heavy brow. He had not shaved in several days. He did not look like a man who had come to offer her salvation or charity or any of the soft things. He looked like a man who had come to say something true. She recognized something in his face. It was the particular set of a person who had been looked at badly for a long time and had stopped flinching from it. She waited. "They've decided you're the devil," he said. His gaze was level. There was no pity in it, which was the first relief she had felt all day. "So come live at the devil's place." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them. Behind them she was aware distantly of the sounds of the square, the murmur of voices, the shifting of feet. She had been judged and found guilty by a town that knew her name and nothing else about her. She was holding a valise containing the total sum of her life. She had, by any reasonable calculation, no options. But she was not accepting this because she had no options. She was looking at this man, this angular, plain-spoken man who had walked through a crowd of people sneering in his direction to say something quietly honest to a woman they had all already condemned, and she was deciding something. She had spent 3 years making choices born of pure desperation. She was choosing now out of something else. She could not have named it then. It felt in the moment like recognition. "What is your name?" she asked. "Silas Thorne." The name meant nothing to her. It clearly meant something to the crowd behind them. She could feel the quality of the silence change, sharpened slightly. But she was not making decisions based on what Ashwood Ridge thought of anything. She picked up her valise. She nodded once, the small, contained nod of a woman who had made her decision. "Lead the way," she said. The walk to the pastor's house was short and silent. The crowd parted for them with the particular physical ambivalence of people who wanted to observe but did not want to be seen endorsing. Pastor Greaves, a thin dyspeptic man with hands like winter branches, performed the ceremony with the minimal vocabulary of a man discharging an obligation he found distasteful. There were no witnesses who came willingly. There were 2 men from the feed store who stayed because they were curious, and 1 older woman who stood in the back with her arms folded and her expression unreadable. The vows were short. Clara's voice was steady. Silas's was quieter but equally clear. When it was done, it was done. There was no celebration. There was no embrace. They walked back out into the cold gray afternoon, and this time the crowd was smaller. The entertainment had reached its conclusion. People had gone back to their business, having collected enough to talk about for several days. Silas's wagon was tied at the post near the edge of the square, an old reliable-looking thing with a broad-backed bay horse that regarded the world with the patient resignation of an animal long accustomed to difficult weather and its owner's habits. Clara climbed up without assistance because he did not offer any, and she did not require it. He untied the horse, climbed up beside her, and clicked his tongue. The horse moved. The wagon rolled north toward the tree line. They did not speak during the ride. It was a long ride, longer than she had anticipated, through bare-armed forest and over a rutted track that the wagon navigated with the confidence of long familiarity. The sky darkened as they traveled, the pewter light thickening toward blue, and the cold that had been merely insistent in the town became genuinely serious out here, away from the windbreak of buildings and the residual warmth of human proximity. The cabin appeared at the end of the track with the abruptness of something that did not bother to announce itself. It was not a fine building. It was the kind of structure that had been built with competence rather than ambition, solid and weather-tight and small. There was a wood pile along the north wall that was prodigiously large. She noted that immediately, the work of someone who took winter seriously. There was a vegetable garden dormant now, its beds turned and mounded. There was a workshop attached to the cabin's east side, and from beneath its door came the faint, clean smell of fresh-cut wood that she would in time come to associate with safety. She stepped down from the wagon while Silas unhitched the horse, and she stood for a moment in front of the door. This was her home now. The word felt like a stone in her mouth, heavy, unfamiliar with edges she hadn't mapped yet. She had not had a home in 3 years. The house in Millhaven had been Robert's house, had always been Robert's house, and she had been in it the way a person is in a room they are allowed to use but do not own. She went inside. The cabin was cold in the way of a place that was heated only intermittently, and the small stove in the main room was banked but not lit. There was a table, a chair, a narrow bed along the far wall with a wool blanket folded at its foot. A shelf held tools and provisions arranged with the orderly practicality of a man who lived alone and had systems. The walls were bare. The floor was swept. There was nothing here that was decorative or soft or unnecessary. It was the interior of a man who had stripped his life down to what worked. She set her valise on the table and stood with her hands at her sides. She heard him come in behind her. She heard him set something down, and then she heard the deliberate sounds of a man with intention. She turned slightly, tracking him with the peripheral hypervigilance she had not been able to unlearn, watching without watching. She had spent 3 years calibrating to the sounds a man made when his mood was shifting to the particular quality of footstep and breath and silence that preceded danger. She could not stop doing it. She was not sure she ever would. But Silas Thorne moved differently than any man she had learned to read. He moved with a kind of unhurried, deliberate stillness, as though he were conscious of the space he occupied and had made a decision about not filling more of it than was necessary. He went to the wood box and began to fill it from the stack near the door, not in the showy, pointed way of a man making a demonstration, simply because it needed doing and the night was coming and it was cold. When the box was full, he built a fire in the stove with the efficiency of long practice. He did not speak. He did not look at her with the checking, measuring look that she had braced herself for, the look that asked what she would do in return, that calculated the transaction. He simply built the fire, and warmth began slowly to assert itself in the room. Then he took the wool blanket from the bed, went to the floor near the hearth, and lay down. She stood and watched him for a moment. She did not understand, not yet. She looked at the narrow bed, the only bed, and looked at him on the floor, already pulling the blanket over his shoulder, already still. "You do not have to sleep on the floor," she said. Her voice came out more careful than she intended, more guarded, freighted with all the reasons she had learned to be careful. "I know," he said, and that was all. She stood for another moment in the growing warmth of the room, and then she sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced her boots and set them side by side on the floor, and she lay down. The mattress was thin but real. The blanket was plain and worn but warm. Through the stove's small ventilation gap, a line of orange light moved against the rough log wall. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and listened to the night sounds of the forest, and to the quiet, even breathing of the man on the floor, and she allowed herself very slowly, 1 degree at a time, to stop waiting for the blow that did not come. Outside, the first snow began to fall. It came without announcement, the way quiet things did, settling on the roof, and on the woodpile, and on the bare vegetable beds, covering the tracks of the wagon that had brought her here, erasing the road she had traveled, blurring the hard edges of everything into something softer and less certain. By morning, the world would look different. By morning, nothing would be where it had been. She closed her eyes. She was still afraid. But beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion and the shame and the long familiar weight of a life that had given her very little, something else was present. Something small and tentative, and not quite definable, a sensation she had not felt in so long that she had no immediate word for it. The fire breathed in the stove. The snow fell. The man on the floor did not move. She slept. She woke before dawn. It was the silence that did it. Not any sound, but the particular quality of stillness that follows a heavy snowfall, a muffled, breathless quiet that pressed against the cabin walls like something physical. For one disoriented moment, she did not know where she was. The ceiling was rung too low, too plain, without the water stain above the Millhaven bedroom that she had spent 3 years staring at. Then the smell of wood smoke reached her and the faint orange glow of embers through the stove grate, and she remembered. She turned her head carefully. The blanket on the floor near the hearth was folded. Silas was already gone. She lay still and listened. From outside, the rhythmic sound of an axe meeting wood. One stroke, a pause, another stroke. Unhurried and steady, the way all his movements were, as though he had made a private agreement with time and time had honored it. She rose. She dressed in the gray half-light, found the water basin on the shelf, broke the thin film of ice on the surface with her knuckle, and washed her face. Old habit. Her mother had always said that the first act of a day set the tone for everything that followed. Clara had kept the habit even in the worst years, even in mornings when the act of washing her face had felt like the only dignified thing left available to her. She found oats in the dry goods shelf, a covered pot, and a hook above the stove. She built the fire up from the coals and began to cook. This, too, was habit. This, too, was something she could do regardless of what else was true. Silas came in from the cold when the light outside had shifted from black to pale gray. He stopped in the doorway for a moment, reading the room, the way she had watched him read everything quietly without obvious reaction. The fire. The pot. Her at the table with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water because there was no coffee, and she had not yet mapped where he kept things. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door. He went to a low cabinet she had not opened and produced a cloth bag, and he set it on the table without comment. Coffee. She looked at it, then at him. He was already moving toward the shelf where the cups were, and his face said nothing in particular, but the gesture itself said something, the same thing the blanket on the floor had said. The same language spoken without words in the only dialect he seemed to use. They ate in silence, not uncomfortable silence, simply silence. Clara had spent years in rooms where silence was a held breath, where the absence of sound meant that something was building, pressurizing about to release in a direction she could not predict. This was not that. This was the silence of two people who had not yet found the shape of each other and were not forcing it. The days that followed had the quality of something careful and deliberate, like the first steps taken on uncertain ice. She learned the cabin. She learned which floorboard creaked near the stove and which drawer stuck in the cold and where the draft came through the north-facing wall when the wind turned. She learned that Silas left before full light and came back by midday or later, depending on the job, that he was a carpenter and a good one, that men from Ashwood Ridge and the surrounding farms hired his hands even as they refused his company, because skill, she observed, was the one currency that prejudice had difficulty devaluing entirely. He built things that held together. That was not nothing. She learned his silences. There were several distinct varieties. There was the silence of concentration when he was working at the bench in the attached shop, and the whole world contracted to whatever piece of wood was under his hands. There was the silence of observation when he would pause in what he was doing and go still in a way that was not absence, but heightened presence, as though he were listening to something beneath the surface of things. And there was the third kind of silence, rarer and harder to name, which she encountered sometimes in the evenings when they sat on opposite sides of the small table, she with the mending, and he with whatever piece he was fitting or planning, and the fire made its small domestic sounds, and the silence between them was not empty, but full of something unspoken that was, she thought, not yet ready to be language. She mended his shirts. This required no discussion. They were torn in several places, the fabric thin at the elbows in the way of garments worn daily for too many seasons, and she had thread and a needle, and the skill, and he needed it done. She did it with the same quiet thoroughness with which she did everything. When he noticed which he did, he said nothing, but the next morning there was a small bunch of dried herbs on the table that had not been there the night before, rosemary and dried lavender tied with a length of twine placed near her side of the table with the careful precision of a man who had thought about placement. She did not thank him. She understood somehow that thanks was not the right response, that it would impose a different kind of ledger on something that was not meant to be a transaction. She put the herbs in the tin cup she used for her morning water. They made the room smell faintly and intermittently like somewhere else, somewhere warmer. She found she liked that. There was one morning, perhaps 2 weeks in, when she came back from the well to find that the axe handle which she had been using to split the smaller kindling, and which had a rough patch of wood just below the head that had been leaving raw spots on her palm, had been sanded smooth. She stood in the cold for a moment, holding the axe, running her thumb along the wood where the roughness had been. The surface was now like something polished, uniform, and careful. She looked toward the workshop door, which was closed, and heard the quiet sound of a plane moving along a board. She went inside and set the axe against the wall and stood for a moment with her back to the door. Something was happening to her. It was happening slowly and without announcement, the way the important things did, and she did not entirely trust it, because trust was a thing she had learned to husband very carefully, and she was afraid in the specific way of someone who has survived disaster that any warmth she allowed herself to feel was simply a prelude to its removal. But the axe handle was smooth, and the herbs were in the cup, and every morning he slept on the floor, and every evening he built the fire without being asked, and not once in all the days she had lived in this cabin had he entered a room as though the room belonged to him in a way that excluded her. He moved through the shared space as though it were genuinely shared, as though her presence in it had changed the nature of his ownership into something more joint and less absolute. She did not know what to do with this. She filed it alongside the other things she did not yet know what to do with, and went back to work. In town, the talk continued. She knew this not because anyone spoke to her directly, because they did not, but because of the occasional small evidence of it. A woman who had been about to enter the dry goods store when Clara appeared at the door, turned, and found a reason to be somewhere else. A group of men near the livery fell quiet when she passed, and waited until she was beyond earshot to resume. Children were instructed by their posture and their sideward glances, and the way they were steered away from her, that she was a category of person to be avoided. She went to town only when necessary. She went for provisions for thread, once for lamp oil. She went with her back straight and her face composed, and she made her purchases without lingering, and she did not look for kindness in the faces of the people she transacted with, because she had stopped requiring it from people who were not inclined to offer it. One afternoon in the 3rd week, she was in the dry goods store when she heard her name spoken in the low carrying voice that people use when they want to be overheard without appearing to intend it. 2 women near the bolts of fabric, one of them the rabbit fur coat woman from the square, whom she had since learned was the wife of a council member. "I cannot imagine what Thorne was thinking," the rabbit fur woman said, not bothering to lower her voice to a register that would not reach the counter where Clara was counting coins. "She has clearly bewitched him in some way, a man in his position, taking in a murderess." "He was never right," the other woman said. "His kind always finds its own level." Clara finished counting her coins. She picked up her wrapped provisions. She turned and walked to the door, and as she passed the 2 women she did not alter her pace or her expression, but she looked very directly at the rabbit fur woman for exactly the length of time it takes to make clear that one has heard every word and has declined to be diminished by it. Then she walked out the door. She was shaking by the time she reached the wagon, not from fear, from the compressed force of everything she had not allowed herself to say, all the words that would have been true and useless, all the defenses that would have changed nothing and cost her everything. She stood at the horse's side with her hand flat against his warm neck, and she breathed, and she waited for the shaking to stop. It stopped. She climbed up and drove home. That evening, Silas came in from the workshop later than usual and found her at the stove with her back to the door, and she did not hear him come in the way she normally did because she had been somewhere else, inside herself, somewhere quiet and tired. She heard him stop. She turned. He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention he sometimes brought to bear, that listening look as though her silence were a text he was carefully reading. "Bad day," he said. It was not a question. "No different than usual," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He hung up his coat. He sat down at the table, and she brought the food, and they ate. And for a while there was only the fire, and the wind outside, and the sound of spoons against tin. Then he said without preamble, "Mrs. Alderson." She looked up. "The rabbit fur coat," he said, and the dry precision of the description startled a small sound out of her that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Her husband sits on the council," Silas said. "He voted to have me removed from the spring contract 3 years running." He said this with the flat, contained tone of someone stating a geographical fact. A river runs east, a mountain stand north. Certain men will always choose their comfort over their conscience. "She said you were never right," Clara said before she could decide whether it was wise to say it. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his cup. "She's not entirely wrong," he said finally. "Not by her measure being the opinion of Alderman Fitch, and the Sunday sermon, and what the town agreed on in 1887, and has not reconsidered since." "And by your measure?" she asked. He looked at her across the table. The firelight moved on the wall behind him. "By my measure," he said, "a person who does what they're told in order to be thought well of isn't being good. They're just being careful." She sat with that for a moment. It was a thing that wanted to be turned over and examined the way certain stones did when you picked them up and found they had more weight than their surface suggested. "They'll come around," she said, not because she believed it, but because it was the thing that was said. "They won't," he said with a gentleness that made the disagreement something other than argument. "And that stopped mattering to me some time ago." She looked at him, at the angular, tired face and the dark eyes that did not flinch from things, at the man who had walked through a sneering crowd to say something quiet and true to a woman he had never met, who had offered his name, not because he wanted something in return, but because he had recognized in her the particular posture of someone who had learned to carry weight alone and had been carrying it for too long. She did not say any of this. There were no words available yet for any of it, but she felt something shift very slightly in the architecture of how she was holding herself in relation to him. Some small internal structure that had been braced and rigid, softened by 1 degree and then held. She picked up the cups to wash them. He went back to his work at the bench. The fire ticked down. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing at the shutters, and the world beyond the cabin walls was very dark and very cold, and inside the lamp burned, and the stove held its warmth, and they moved around each other in the small space with the growing unconscious ease of two people who had, without entirely meaning to, begun to know the shape of each other. It was not love yet. It was something that preceded love, something more foundational. It was safety. The specific, rare, astonishing sensation of being in a place where you did not have to watch the door. One evening, nearly a month in, she came in from bringing wood to find him at the table with a small object in his hands that he set down when she entered quickly but not secretively. She caught a glimpse of it, a carved piece, small a bird, or something like one rough-hewn and in progress. She did not remark on it. But the next morning it was on the window ledge near the stove, finished a small wooden sparrow with wings slightly lifted as though it had just decided to go somewhere and had not yet committed to leaving. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the particular choice of subject, a bird that stays near the ground, but is not of the ground, a bird associated everywhere with ordinary survival, with the small miracle of continuing. She reached out and touched it with one finger. She did not move it. She left it exactly where he had placed it on the ledge where the morning light would find it, and she went about her day, and if her chest was tight with something that had no clean name, she was becoming accustomed to that sensation, and was beginning slowly to stop being afraid of it. The weeks were folding into each other now, one day, a quiet echo of the last, and in the accumulation of those quiet days, something was being built between them that neither had designed or planned. The way the best things were sometimes built, not by intention, but by the patient layering of small, true acts, each one too modest to notice in isolation, but collectively forming something solid, something that might in time be strong enough to hold against whatever the world decided to send their way. Outside, the snow deepened. The track to town became harder to navigate. The world contracted to the radius of the cabin and the woods, and within that radius, two people who had both been exiled from the ordinary warmth of human belonging were discovering one careful degree at a time that warmth was still possible, that it could be made if not found, that it did not require the permission of Ashwood Ridge or anyone in it. The sparrow sat in the window, the fire burned, the snow fell, and somewhere beneath the carefully maintained surface of Clara Voss, in the deep protected places where she had long since stopped expecting anything good to grow, something was changing, something slow and fragile and necessary, something that had no name yet, but was beginning very quietly to put down roots. The blizzard came without much warning. There had been signs the way there were always signs if a person knew how to read the particular language of a sky that was preparing to do something serious. The clouds had been building since mid-morning, coming in from the northwest in stacked heavy formations that had a greenish undertone when the light caught them at the right angle. The temperature had dropped sharply just after noon, not the gradual cooling of an ordinary winter afternoon, but the sudden decisive drop of air that has made up its mind. The horses in the small lean-to shelter behind the cabin had grown restless. Silas had noticed all of this and had said nothing about it directly, but she had watched him move through the afternoon with a quiet additional purposefulness, bringing in extra wood without being asked, checking the shutters, filling the water barrel inside the door. By the time the first real wind came, they were prepared, or as prepared as two people in a drafty cabin at the edge of a forest could be against a storm that turned out to be one of those storms, the kind that the old-timers in any territory eventually named, not officially, but in the way that extreme weather earned names in the telling and retelling, the kind that rearranged the landscape and made people grateful for walls. The sound of it was what she had not anticipated. She had been through winter storms before, in Mill Haven in the frame house with its thick plaster walls and its heavy curtains and its entirely separate miseries. But this was different out here, exposed with only logs between the inside and the outside world. The wind came in gusts that struck the cabin like something with weight behind it, like a fist rather than a breath, and the sound it made in the trees was not the gentle sigh of a winter wind in a poem, but a low, continuous roar that rose and fell and rose again, and had in its deeper registers a quality that was almost vocal. Clara was at the stove when the first big gust hit, and the lamp flame bent hard to one side and the shutters hammered in their casings. She gripped the edge of the shelf. She told herself it was the cold. It was not the cold. It was the sound. Sound was the thing she had never been able to fully explain to anyone, because it had never been relevant to explain it before, because there had been no one to explain it to. But certain sounds did something to her that was not rational, and was not chosen, and was not, despite 3 years of determined effort, something she had been able to train herself entirely out of. Deep, percussive sounds. Things that struck without warning. The sound of something breaking. The specific quality of a door opening at an unexpected hour. She had spent 3 years sleeping with one part of her mind always on alert, always cataloging the sounds of the house, always waiting. She did not always know when it happened that it was happening. It came on gradually sometimes, and then all at once, a narrowing of the available world, a heightening of certain sensations, and a dimming of others. A sense of being simultaneously in the present moment and somewhere else entirely, somewhere she could not leave by simply deciding to leave. Silas came in from checking the lean-to and shed his coat and hat and stopped. She was standing at the stove with both hands gripping the shelf and her eyes on the middle distance, and her breathing was audible in the way it only was when a person was managing something difficult. The lamp flame had steadied itself. The wind outside had dropped for a moment, the way blizzards sometimes did, gathering for the next assault. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not move toward her quickly. He pulled out the chair closest to the stove and sat down in it, unhurried in the way of someone who had decided to be in a particular place for a while and was comfortable with that decision. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the fire. The next gust hit. The cabin shuddered. The sound in the trees rose to its roar, and her hands tightened on the shelf. And she was only partly in the room, partly somewhere else. In a dark hallway waiting, listening for footsteps. "Tell me about where you're from," Silas said. His voice was calm and unhurried and entirely ordinary, the voice of a man making conversation by the fire on a winter evening. "Before Millhaven." The question was so unexpected and so normal that it pulled at her, reached into the dark hallway where part of her was standing, and tugged at her sleeve. She turned her head slightly toward him. "Indiana," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Flat country," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire, giving her the privacy of not being observed. "I went through Indiana once, going east. Everything was corn." "In summer," she said. "In summer it was all corn. You couldn't see the horizon from June to September." "And in winter," she exhaled. The wind screamed and then fell. "In winter you could see forever," she said. "It was the flattest, coldest, emptiest thing. My mother said you could see the edge of the world from our porch. I believed her until I was 7. What happened when you were 7? I asked my school teacher about the edge of the world, and she explained that the earth was round, and I went home and told my mother she was wrong." A pause. She said she knew. She said some lies were worth telling because they made the winter shorter. Something almost like a smile moved across Silas's face there and gone. Smart woman. She was. The word was a small, heavy thing. Clara moved from the shelf to the other chair at the table. She sat. The storm howled, and she truly heard it now, as weather again rather than threat. "She died when I was 14 fever." "I'm sorry." She looked at her hands on the table. "After that, it was just my father, and he was a quiet man. Not unkind, just very far away inside himself. He did what fathers were supposed to do, and then he died too, and I was 22, and there was a man who said he wanted to take care of me." She stopped. The fire shifted in the stove, a log settling, and the sound of it was domestic and small and safe. "Robert Voss," she said. It was the first time she had spoken his name in this cabin. It sat strangely in the air like something brought in from outside that didn't quite belong in the warmth. Silas said nothing. He was still looking at the fire. His hands were still on his knees. His whole body communicated the same thing. "I am here. I am not going anywhere. Take whatever time the truth requires." "He was charming," she said. "That is always how it starts in these stories, I think. He was charming and attentive, and he said all the things that a woman who has been lonely for a long time is most vulnerable to hearing." She was aware of her own voice, the flatness of it, the careful clinical distance she was using. She had told herself this story before, in the private audience of her own mind, always in this voice, always as though it had happened to someone she knew rather than to herself. The drinking was there from the beginning. I only understood later that I hadn't seen it because I hadn't known what to look for. The storm surged. The lamp flickered. She did not flinch. "The first time he hit me, we had been married 4 months," she said. He cried afterward. He said it would never happen again. She paused. It happened again. In the silence that followed, she became aware of a quality of stillness in Silas that was different from his ordinary stillness. It was tighter. Something in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, something contained and deliberately held. 3 years, she said. I stayed 3 years. People ask why when they are brave enough to ask anything at all. The answer is not simple, and it is not one thing. It is money and fear and the particular way that a person who is struck often enough begins to believe, despite all evidence, that the striking is in some way their fault. It is the morning after, when he was gentle, when he was the man I had married, and I would think this time. It is the fact that his family was powerful, and the town knew it, and I had no one. She looked up at Silas. He was looking at her now directly with that dark and steady gaze that held no pity, which was what she had always hated most about the rare occasions when someone had glimpsed the truth. The pity which made her feel smaller, which made her feel like a thing to be helped, rather than a person who had survived. There was no pity in his face. There was something harder than pity, and more valuable. There was anger, the clean, outward-directed kind on her behalf, rather than at her, and beneath it something that she recognized with a start as the expression of a man who understood what it meant to be at the mercy of people who used power carelessly. He died in November, she said. He had been drinking since midday. He took his horse out in the dark on a road he knew badly, even sober. The horse threw him at the creek crossing. She pressed her lips together for a moment. I did not kill him. I had thought about it. I will not pretend otherwise. I had thought about it in the way that someone in a burning room thinks about jumping, but I did not do it. He did it himself with his own habits and his own pride and the dark. His family, Silas said. His voice was very quiet. His family needed it to be something other than what it was, she said. If it was an accident, then he was careless and foolish, and the great Robert Voss died of his own vices. If I killed him, then he was a victim, and I was a monster, and the story was much more convenient for everyone. She spread her hands on the table, studying them, as though they belonged to someone she was trying to understand. They had a doctor write a letter. They had a lawyer notarize it. They had a very old and very respected family name, and I had nothing, and so I ran. The blizzard pressed against the walls. The fire breathed. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you been carrying that?" She considered the question. "Which part?" "All of it." She looked at him. The lamplight moved on his face, and she thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, because it was not the question she had been expecting, and it was not the question anyone else had ever asked. Not how did it happen? Not why didn't you leave sooner? Not what is the truth? All the questions that were really about the asker's need for a clean narrative. But how long? As though the duration itself were the thing that mattered, as though the weight of the years was something worth acknowledging in its own right. 3 years of the marriage, she said finally, and 1 year running, and then 9 days on a stagecoach. She paused. 4 years and 9 days. He nodded slowly. The nod of a man receiving information he intended to take seriously. I exposed the mayor, he said then. It came out of him with the same quality hers had not rehearsed, not a prepared speech, but the particular cadence of something being said out loud for perhaps the first time, or the first time to someone who was truly listening. Harlan Burke. He was skimming from the county road fund, had been for 6 years. The money was meant for bridge repairs, and it was going into a land purchase up north, his brother-in-law's land, which the county then bought from that brother-in-law at twice its value. He looked at his hands. I knew because I had done some of the carpentry work on those bridges, and I knew what materials should have cost, and I could see what materials had actually been used. I kept records. I went to the circuit judge. Clara watched him. The circuit judge and Harlan Burke had been friends since they were boys, Silas said. The case was dismissed. The records I submitted were declared incomplete. The mayor gave a speech in the square about the importance of civic loyalty and the danger of men who set themselves up against the institutions that protected everyone. The flat precision of his telling was, she understood now, not absence of feeling, but the voice of someone who had processed the feeling many times over many years and had arrived at something beyond it. I lost 3 contracts that week. By the end of the month, there were 7. Within the year, the only work I could get were the jobs that needed doing badly enough that people would hire even me. They exiled you without ever asking you to leave, she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition, the particular recognition of a person who has found unexpectedly the exact right words for something they had been carrying wordlessly. That is exactly what they did, he said. The storm was still running its full force outside, but the cabin felt differently enclosed. Now the walls not merely a barrier against weather, but a boundary, a demarcation between the inside world, which was theirs, and the outside world, which could rage as it liked. Clara became aware that her hands were no longer gripped tight in her lap, but rested open on the table, turned upward, which was not a posture she adopted easily or often. Silas reached across the table. He did not take her hand. He placed his own hand palm down on the table between them, in the space that separated her hands from his, not quite touching an offer rather than a claim. She looked at his hand. The carpenter's hand, broad and scarred, with the particular calluses of someone who had worked with wood for 20 years, the heel of the palm and the base of the fingers worn smooth. She moved one hand slightly, not much an inch or less, so that the edge of her little finger just barely made contact with the edge of his. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm ran itself through its full and furious vocabulary. The howling and the hammering and the long orchestral moan of wind in a forest fighting to stand. But the cabin was warm. The fire was steady. The lamp burned without flickering now because Silas had banked the drafts while she had been somewhere else, tending to everything quietly as was his way. The weeks that followed the blizzard had a different quality than the weeks before it. Nothing dramatic had changed, not on the surface, not in the practical arrangements of their days, or the distribution of tasks, or the spare functional rhythm of their shared domestic life. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and something had been heard that could not be unheard, and the cabin that had seemed in the early days like a temporary shelter, a place she was staying until something else became available, had become, without her noticing the exact moment of transition, simply home. She began to do things without calculating them first. She left his coffee on the bench in the workshop on cold mornings without planning to do it, found herself doing it because it was the thing to do, and then registering the decision only after it was made. She caught herself one afternoon humming while she worked and stopped abruptly, and then after a moment started again, because the humming had not been a performance for anyone, and there was no reason to suppress it. He left things for her, not dramatically. The bundle of winter berries on the table one morning, deep red against the bleached wood, gathered from somewhere in the trees. A length of good ribbon left beside her sewing basket. Deep blue, the color of the dress she had worn the first week, which she had not thought he noticed. Small things. Things that required attention to give that said without saying, "I see you." Not the generalized you of charity or pity, but the specific, particular you of genuine regard. One afternoon she was in the workshop doorway watching him work. He was fitting a joint, a complex one, the kind that required a precision she could see in the set of his whole body, the way he breathed differently when the work required absolute concentration. He was not aware of her watching, or if he was, he gave no sign. She watched the way his hands moved, certain and knowing the way a man's hands moved when they had learned something so deeply that the knowledge had migrated from the mind into the muscle. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her by its suddenness that she was glad she was here, not resigned, not making the best of circumstances. Glad. Specifically, genuinely glad in the way she had not been glad of anything in 4 years and 9 days. He looked up and caught her watching him. She did not look away, which was new, which would not have been possible 2 months ago. He held her gaze for a moment, then he went back to his work. But around the corner of his mouth was something that had not been there the first day, something not quite a smile, but in the same country as one. She went back inside and stood at the window where the small wooden sparrow sat on the ledge. Outside the snow was still deep, but the sky had cleared, and the winter sun came through the glass at a low angle and caught the sparrow's lifted wings and threw a small, precise shadow on the sill. She put her finger under the sparrow's wings just barely, the way she had the first morning, and she thought about his voice saying, "How long have you been carrying that?" And she thought about 4 years and 9 days, and she thought about the hand on the table in the space between. She thought about what it felt like to stop waiting for the blow. The cold outside was real, and the town's opinion was unchanged, and the road to Ashwood Ridge was still a road. She walked with her spine braced and her face composed. None of that had become simple. None of that had resolved itself. But here inside the radius of the cabin and the workshop and the woodpile and the cleared track through the trees, something had become possible, that she had stopped believing in something ordinary and enormous and irreplaceable. She was known. Not the version of her that Millhaven had invented, not the version that Ashwood Ridge had decided upon, not the version that Robert Voss had tried to grind her down into. The actual, specific, complicated, scarred, and enduring self that she carried inside all those constructed versions, like a seed inside a husk. She was known by one person in one cabin at the edge of one dark forest. For now, in this winter, it was enough. It was, in fact, more than she had allowed herself to want for a very long time, and the wanting of it she was discovering did not make her weak. It made her in ways she was only beginning to understand extraordinarily difficult to destroy. Spring came to Ashwood Ridge the way it always did in that country. Not gently, not with any of the pastoral softness that the word suggested, but in fits and arguments. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones, mud, replacing snow, and then freezing again overnight into treacherous, uneven terrain that was somehow worse than the clean difficulty of deep winter. The creek behind the cabin ran fast and loud with snowmelt. The birches at the tree line put out their first tentative buds, pale green against the white bark, and then a late frost came and burned them back, and they tried again, because that was what birches did. Clara watched the season change from the cabin window with the particular attention she had developed over the winter for small natural things. The sparrow on the ledge had accumulated a thin film of workshop dust, which she cleaned away every few days with the corner of her apron. The garden beds Silas had mounded in the fall were beginning to show the dark, workable quality of soil that was ready. She had plans for those beds, had been making them through the deep of winter, a private project conducted in the margins of her days. Seeds she had ordered through the dry goods store from a catalog, paying with the small wages Silas had begun insisting she take from the household account. Not charity, he had said in the tone that closed a discussion contribution. She had stopped arguing about small dignities. She had come to understand that Silas Thorne expressed what mattered to him not through declaration but through the patient repeated insistence of practical acts. The wages were his way of saying, "Your labor has value." She received them in the spirit they were offered. It was in the second week of March that the stranger's horse appeared on the track. She saw it before she heard anything, a dark shape moving through the bare trees at a pace that was not the ambling approach of a neighbor or a delivery, but the purposeful, ground-eating canter of someone who knew where they were going and was in a measured hurry to arrive. She watched from the window for a moment, then went to the door. The man who rode into the clearing was perhaps 45, lean and weathered in the specific way of men who spent most of their lives traveling between places rather than inhabiting them. He wore a long brown coat and a hat pulled low against the March wind, and there was something about the way he sat his horse upright and watchful that communicated professional habit. He had the eyes of a man who catalogued everything he looked at and forgot nothing. He saw her in the doorway and did not change his expression. He pulled up his horse a polite distance from the porch. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, not a question. He had known who she was before he arrived. "Yes," she said, "my name is Calvin Dreer." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, holding it up so she could see it had an official seal, though he made no move to hand it to her yet. "I've been retained by the estate of Robert Voss of Mill Haven in the matter of certain outstanding legal questions pertaining to his death." The morning was very clear and cold. A woodpecker was working somewhere in the trees behind the cabin. She heard it with the part of her mind that was always registering the world, filing it, while the rest of her went very still. "My husband is in the workshop," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "I'll get him." She did not run to the workshop. She walked because running would have told Dreer something she did not wish to tell him, and because she needed the 12 steps between the door and the workshop to arrange herself. She pushed open the workshop door. Silas was at the bench, a long piece of oak clamped before him, a plane in his hand. He looked up. She said simply, "There is a bounty hunter in the yard." He set the plane down. He looked at her face for a moment with that reading look, taking in what she was telling him beyond the words. Then he came out from behind the bench and picked up his coat from the peg and followed her. Calvin Dreer had dismounted and stood at the edge of the clearing. He was the kind of man Clara observed who made himself difficult to read by design, who had learned to keep his face in a neutral register that communicated competence without threat, at least until threat became useful. He watched Silas come out of the workshop and did his cataloging, and adjusted something in his calculation, though nothing showed in his face. "Mr. Thorne," he said. Silas said nothing. He stood beside Clara on the porch and looked at Dreer with the patient, assessing attention he brought to problems that required thought. Dreer produced the document again, and this time he extended it. Silas took it. He unfolded it and read it with the thoroughness of a man who had learned not to skip anything in documents that concerned him. Clara watched his face. It told her very little. The papers were thick, several pages, and they had the appearance of something official, notarized seals, flowing signatures, language in the formal register of legal instruments. "These papers," Silas said, "claim she poisoned him." "They present evidence to that effect," Dreer said. "Medical testimony from a physician in Mill Haven. Sworn statements from 2 members of the Voss household staff." "The physician," Silas said, "is he a relation of the Voss family?" Dreer's expression shifted by the smallest degree. "He has a practice in Mill Haven." "That is not what I asked." A pause. "His wife is a Voss cousin." Silas folded the papers along their original creases and held them back out to Dreer. "Then these papers are the opinion of a family that lost a son and needed somewhere to put the blame, dressed up in legal language, and notarized by someone whose livelihood depends on that family's goodwill." Dreer received the papers. He did not argue with what Silas had said. He simply put the documents back in his coat with the care of a man maintaining his instruments. "My position," he said, "is not to argue the merits. My position is to deliver the papers and observe the response. The response is noted." He looked at Clara, then directly for the first time since Silas had appeared. "Mrs. Thorne, the Voss family is prepared to settle this quietly. They're not asking for a trial. They're asking for an acknowledgement." "An acknowledgement of what?" Clara said. "That certain events surrounding Robert Voss's death remain unresolved. That you left Millhaven in a manner that raised questions. That the family deserves at minimum a formal statement." "A confession," she said. Dreer was quiet for a moment. "A statement?" he repeated gently, which was worse than if he had said it plainly. She looked at him, and she thought about the Voss family, and their lawyer, and their physician cousin, and their sworn household staff, and she thought about how much money could make truth into a flexible substance, how much it could stretch and reshape what was sworn and witnessed and sealed. She had spent a year understanding this. "I have nothing to confess," she said. "I have nothing to acknowledge. I left Millhaven because I was afraid, and I was afraid because powerful people with a reason to lie were constructing a story, and I had no means to fight it. That is the sum of my involvement in Robert Voss's death." Dreer nodded once with the non-committal courtesy of a professional. He remounted his horse. He looked down at them both from the slight elevation of the saddle. "I'll be in Ashwood Ridge for a few days," he said. "The offer stands." He turned his horse and rode back up the track through the bare trees without hurrying. They stood on the porch and watched him go. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely, Silas said, "He's going to talk to the town council." "Yes," she said. "They'll be glad of the excuse." She had been thinking exactly this. She had been thinking it from the moment she saw the horse in the trees. The town of Ashwood Ridge had been holding its collective opinion of Clara Thorne in a kind of suspended state, not pursuing it actively, but not releasing it, either waiting in the way that certain kinds of communities waited for external validation of what they had already decided. Calvin Dreer and his sealed documents were precisely that validation. He had ridden into town like a confirmation of their instincts. She was right. It took 3 days. In those 3 days, she and Silas moved through their ordinary life with a deliberate, quiet purposefulness of people who understood that what was coming, regardless of what they did, and that the best preparation was not frantic activity, but steadiness. They ate their meals. He worked. She turned the garden beds and put in the early cold weather seeds. They sat in the evenings with the lamp between them, and once she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing to say that the holding did not already say more precisely. On the third morning she woke to the sound of horses. Not one horse the measured approach of a single rider, but several moving together with the slightly ragged synchronization of a group that has organized itself around a common purpose and is not entirely comfortable with the solidarity it has manufactured. She was at the window before she was fully conscious of having decided to move. There were 8 of them at the edge of the clearing. 5 men on horseback, 3 on foot, who had come from the other direction through the trees. She recognized Mayor Burke Broad and self-important on a gray horse, and 2 of the council members, and Pastor Greaves, thin-shouldered and carrying his Bible as though it were a tool of his trade rather than a document of his faith. Calvin Dreer was there too, to one side, his horse still and his face professionally blank. Silas was already dressed. He had heard them before. She realized. He was standing at the center of the room with his hunting rifle in his hands, not raised, held at his side, and his face was the face she had come to know, when he was in the third kind of silence, the full purposeful stillness of a man who has made his decisions and is at peace with them. "Stay inside," he said. "No," she said. He looked at her. He did not argue. He recognized she thought the same thing in her face that she had recognized in his, the face of a person who has made their decisions. They went out together. Mayor Burke's horse shifted when they appeared on the porch, picking up something in the rider's tension. Burke himself was wearing the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and was now performing it for the audience he had assembled. He was the kind of man who required an audience for all his significant moments. "Thorne," he said. He did not look at Clara. "You know why we're here." "Tell me anyway," Silas said. Burke reached into his coat and produced copies of Dreer's documents. "The Voss family has presented compelling evidence that the woman you have taken into your home and given your name is responsible for the death of her previous husband. Mr. Dreer here has been deputized by the Millhaven court to bring her in for questioning." "She has answered Mr. Dreer's question," Silas said. "Here on this porch 3 days ago, she had nothing further to say." "That is not how the law works, Silas." "Which law?" Silas said. "And which court, and which judge, and who appointed that judge, and who is that judge's wife's cousin?" The words were flat and precise, and their clarity landed in the morning air like stones dropped into still water. Burke's face reddened. "You are obstructing justice," Burke said. "I am standing on my own land," Silas said. It was Pastor Greaves who spoke next, and he did it with the particular kind of courage that men summoned when they had the weight of perceived moral authority behind them. "Silas, I have prayed over this. I have given it serious thought. This woman's history is documented. The evidence is credible. Whatever your personal feelings in the matter, you cannot allow your household to become a sanctuary for someone who may well be guilty of a terrible crime. That is not what a man of good conscience does." "What a man of good conscience does," Silas said without heat, without elevation of voice, "is not decided by the man who declared the Harlan Burke land deal a matter of civic progress." The silence that followed this had a very specific texture. Several of the men looked at the ground. Greaves's face went through several rapid transitions. Burke's redness deepened. Burke said, "This is your last opportunity, Silas. Surrender her to Mr. Dreer. Step aside. You have my word that your cooperation will be remembered favorably. The contracts, your standing in this community, it can all be restored, but only if you act like a reasonable man." In the quiet that followed, Clara heard the creek in the distance running fast with its snowmelt, indifferent to all of this. She heard the woodpecker again, still working somewhere in the same tree it had found 3 days ago. She heard her own heartbeat not fast, but very present, very deliberate, the heartbeat of a body that understood what was at stake. She looked at Silas. She looked at him, and she thought about everything she knew of him. The floor near the hearth, the sanded axe handle, the carved sparrow, the hand on the table, in the lamplight, the voice saying, "How long have you been carrying that?" She thought about what it had cost him to be the kind of man he was in a town that punished exactly that kind of man. She thought about the contracts he had lost and the exile he had endured, and the long solitary years at the edge of the woods with only his work and his integrity for company. And she thought with a clarity that was almost physical in its force, that she could not let this be the thing that destroyed him. All of this had come to Ashwood Ridge because of her. The bounty hunter, the documents, the assembled men in the clearing, with their horses and their sealed papers and their offer of restored standing, all of it was here because of the history she carried. And if Silas refused to step aside, if he held his ground, as she knew he would hold it, then he would lose everything he had left. The work. What remained of his reputation. Perhaps more. She stepped forward. "Silas," she said. Her voice came out low and controlled. He turned to look at her. She held his gaze for a moment, trying to tell him with her eyes what she was about to do, trying to ask his forgiveness for it, trying to say goodbye to the thing between them without words, because there were no words available and no time. Then she looked at the assembled men. She looked at Burke and Greaves and Calvin Dreer and the anonymous righteous faces behind them, and she let her voice rise so that everyone in the clearing could hear it. "They are right," she said, "about all of it." She heard Silas go very still beside her. She did not look at him. "I killed Robert Voss," she said. The words were ash in her mouth. Lies had a specific weight she had learned, and this one was heavier than most because it was not only false, but was the precise inversion of something true. "I did what they say I did. I left Millhaven because I knew the law would catch up to me eventually." She turned to Silas, and she made her voice as cold as she could make it, which was very cold because she had learned cold from necessity. "Step aside, Silas. You know nothing about what I truly am. You married a story. That is all." She reached out and put both hands against his chest and pushed a physical gesture of rejection that she felt in every part of herself, like pushing against the grain of her own will. "Step aside." He did not step aside. He stood where he was and looked at her, and his eyes were doing the thing they always did, the reading the going beneath the surface, and she thought for one desperate moment that perhaps she had made it convincing enough, that perhaps the cold voice and the false confession and the physical push had been sufficient, that perhaps he would let her go, that the thing she was giving up would be accepted. He reached out and took her hands. Not to restrain her, to hold her. His hands closed over hers where they had been pressing against his chest, and he held them there, and he looked at her with the full, ungoverned depth of those dark eyes, and she understood that he had heard every word she said and believed none of them, and that she had never in her life been so thoroughly and mercifully known. "No," he said. It was the quietest word in the clearing. It was also the loudest. He turned to face Burke and Greaves and Dreer and the assembled men of Ashwood Ridge, and he was still holding her hands, and the rifle was still at his side, and his voice, when he spoke, was not raised because he had never needed volume to be heard. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I am going to say it once." The clearing was completely silent except for the creek and the wind and the distant woodpecker working at its patient tree. "I know this woman," Silas said. "I know her the way a man knows his own land by every season, by what it does when it's tested, by what grows in it and what doesn't. I know what she is made of." His hands tightened slightly over hers. "She did not do what those papers say. And if you have an argument with that, you will need better evidence than the opinion of a dead man's family and the word of a physician who owes his practice to that family's goodwill." He looked at Dreer directly. "Those documents are fraudulent, and you know it. You are a professional, and you have read enough real legal instruments in your career to know the difference between law and money wearing law's clothes." Dreer's face moved just slightly. "I am not surrendering my wife," Silas said. "I am not stepping aside, and if you want to take her, you will have to walk over my dead body to do it." He said it without drama, without the trembling intensity of a man making a speech. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, quietly, in the tone of a man stating a fact about the weather or the load-bearing capacity of a joint, which made it the most terrifying thing anyone in that clearing had ever heard. Burke's horse shifted again. The men on foot had stopped where they were. Clara felt through the hands that held hers the absolute rock-solid steadiness of him, and something inside her, something that had been holding itself in a sustained, exhausting tension for 4 years and 9 days, cracked open. She was crying. She had not cried in front of another person since her mother's funeral. She was crying now, silently, with the tears running straight down her face, and she did not wipe them away because her hands were held, and she did not want them released. Mayor Burke opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He looked at Calvin Dreer. Dreer looked at Silas, and then at Clara, and then at the rifle still at Silas's side, still not raised, and Clara watched him complete his professional calculation. The calculation of a man who understood with the pragmatic clarity of his trade that the situation had shifted, that the town was wavering, that a man who would not raise his rifle was more dangerous than one who would, because a man with a raised rifle could be called a threat and dealt with accordingly. But a man standing quietly on his own land holding his wife's hands was something else entirely. Something that the language of bounty law did not have easy words for. In the silence, Clara's tears dried on her face in the cold March air. She breathed. She looked at Silas, the side of his face, the set of his jaw, the way he stood as though the ground beneath him were his by right and by choice and by every decision he had ever made. And she thought about what he had just done. He had not done it with the rifle. He had not done it with threats or volume or the performance of masculine courage. He had done it with the simple, immovable fact of who he was. He had stood in front of everything the town of Ashwood Ridge had to offer and said no, because he knew her and knowing her was enough. She understood standing on that porch in the pale March light, with the creek running its snow-melt song in the distance, that this was what she had not known it was possible to receive. Not rescue, not charity, not the protection of a man who owned her survival, but the loyalty of a person who had looked at all the evidence and all the pressure and all the offered incentive of restored standing and had chosen her anyway. Not because she was innocent, not because he could prove it, because he knew her soul, and her soul was not what the papers said it was, and that knowledge was for Silas Thorne not a feeling but a fact as solid and weight-bearing as the joints he fitted in his workshop, as real and reliable as good oak. She stopped being a woman who was waiting for the blow. She was done. Burke spoke again, but she was no longer listening to him with the fearful attention she had given powerful men for 4 years. She heard him as whether as noise, as a thing that was happening at the periphery of the world she was now inhabiting, which was a world with Silas at its center and her own 2 feet on her own porch, and the first pale stirrings of something enormous moving up through the cold ground of her. She had carried it for 4 years and 9 days. She was putting it down. What came next was hers to do. She understood this completely in the sudden clarifying way of someone who has been waiting for permission that was never coming and has finally understood that no one else can grant it. It had to come from inside. It had always had to come from inside. She had simply needed first to stand beside a man who believed in what was inside her enough for her to remember it existed. She released his hands, not to step away from him, to free her own. She reached into the front of her dress. Her fingers found it by memory. She had carried it so long that her body had learned its exact dimensions the way a person learns the shape of an old scar, not by looking, but by the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 unconscious touches. It was small, smaller than anyone would have expected given the weight of what it contained. A journal bound in dark leather, slim and worn at the corners, its cover stained with something that had dried to a deep rust brown in a pattern that ran along the spine and bled unevenly onto the front cover. She had kept it inside her dress for 4 years. Through the flight from Millhaven, through 9 days on a stagecoach, through every night in the cabin when she had removed it only to sleep with it under the mattress close enough to feel its presence, she held it out in front of her. The clearing was still. Even the wind seemed to pause the way it sometimes did between gusts gathering itself. The men on horseback and the men on foot, and Calvin Dreer with his professional stillness, and Mayor Burke with his reddened face, all looked at the small object in her hand, and none of them knew yet what they were looking at, and the not knowing held them in a suspended collective attention. "This is my husband's journal," Clara said. Her voice had changed. It was no longer the controlled, careful voice she had used for 4 years to move through a world that required her to be small and unthreatening. It was lower. It was steadier. It was the voice of a woman who had made a decision, and was no longer afraid of what that decision would cost her. Robert Voss kept this journal for 3 years. He was a methodical man in certain ways. He recorded things. She looked at Dreer specifically because Dreer was the one in the clearing whose opinion was worth addressing. Burke would perform whatever the moment required of him. The councilmen were followers. Pastor Greaves operated in the register of decided conviction. But Dreer was a man who dealt in evidence for a living, and evidence was what she held. He recorded the dates, she said. He recorded what he used. He recorded quantities because he was proud of being precise. She opened the journal to a page she knew, without searching her fingers, finding it the way they found the journal itself, by long and private familiarity. November the 3rd, 1884. He writes about how he struck me across the left side of my face with the flat of his hand because he felt the dinner was inadequate. November the 7th, he struck me again for answering a question in a tone he found impertinent. She turned the page. Her hands were not shaking. She was aware of this with a distant observing part of herself, that her hands were not shaking, that she was standing on the porch of her own home, in the March light, reading from a dead man's journal, and her hands were not shaking. December the 2nd, he writes that he restrained me against the kitchen wall to prevent me from leaving the house when he did not want me to leave. He uses the word restrained. He recorded it with the same tone he used for his inventory counts, as a fact of household management. The clearing was very quiet. January the 9th, 1885, she continued, her voice did not waver. She had rehearsed this in her mind 1,000 times, had known that if the moment ever came, she would have to speak it plainly, without collapse. Without the softening of tears, because tears would allow the people listening to redirect their attention to her emotion, rather than to the information. He describes how he pulled me down the back stairs by my hair because he believed I had spoken to the neighbor without his permission. He describes how I struck the wall on the way down and could not walk without assistance for 2 weeks after. She looked up from the page. He records this because he was keeping an account of what he considered his household in order. He was not a man who saw his own behavior as something requiring concealment. He was a man who saw it as his right. She closed the journal. She held it out toward Dreer. The physician the Voss family used to write their testimony, she said, examined Robert Voss after his death and found what he was paid to find. He did not examine me. If he had, he would have found a record on my body that corresponds precisely with the record in this journal, because bodies keep accounts too, even after they are given no choice in the matter. Dreer had not moved. He was looking at the journal in her extended hand with the expression of a man whose professional equilibrium was being seriously tested. He had not expected this. She could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes, the fractional adjustment of his posture. He had expected, she supposed, one of several predictable responses to the morning's confrontation. He had not expected this. "There is also this," she said. She reached again into the front of her dress and produced a second document, this one folded into a tight square. The paper softer with age and handling than the crisp official papers Dreer carried. She unfolded it carefully and held it so he could see. A medical report written by Dr. August Heller of Cartwright County 7 months before Robert Voss died. Dr. Heller examined me at my own request in private without Robert Voss's knowledge. He documented his findings with full clinical detail. He was prepared to present them in court if I ever found the courage to bring a case. She paused. I did not find that courage in time. I have been carrying his report alongside Robert's journal ever since as the only proof I possessed that the story the Voss family is telling is not the story of what actually happened in that house. She walked down the 2 porch steps and crossed the frozen ground of the clearing and held both documents out to Calvin Dreer directly. Dreer looked at them for a long moment. Then he reached out and took them. The silence while he read was the most absolute silence she had ever stood inside. She was aware of Silas behind her on the porch, his presence as physical and real as the cold air or the ground under her feet. She was aware of the men ranged around the clearing and the horses and the white winter sky overhead. She was aware of her own breathing slow and even in and out, the breath of a woman who had stopped running and was done. Dreer read for a long time. He was thorough, which she had anticipated. He turned every page of the journal, not all the entries, but enough sampling the record with the trained eye of a man who knew how to read for pattern and consistency and the specific texture of authentic documentation versus the constructed smoothness of fabrication. He read Dr. Heller's report twice. She watched his face as he read, and what she saw there was not dramatic, but it was significant. The professional neutrality held, but beneath it, something was shifting, recalibrating, arriving at a different conclusion than the one he had ridden into this clearing carrying. When he finished, he refolded Dr. Heller's report along its worn creases. He closed the journal. He held both items for a moment looking at them in his hands, and then he looked at Mayor Burke. "The documents I was given," Dreer said slowly, and with great precision, were presented to me as the primary evidentiary basis for this matter. I accepted that characterization in good faith. He looked at Burke. "These materials substantially alter the evidentiary picture. The physician's notation of injuries consistent with long-term physical abuse dated 7 months prior to Robert Voss's death directly contradicts the central claim of the family's medical testimony." He paused. "And this journal, if it is authentic, which its physical condition and internal consistency suggest it is not the record of a man who feared for his safety in his own household. It is the record of a man who believed himself entitled to use his household however he chose." Burke's face had gone through several changes and had arrived at something complicated, the face of a man whose plan had developed an unexpected structural failure, and who was searching urgently for a way to address it that did not require him to acknowledge that the failure was his. "You cannot simply take her word that the journal is genuine," Burke said. "It could be fabricated. She could have written it herself." "She could have," Dreer said. "So could anyone." He looked at Burke steadily. "The question of whether to pursue this matter further is one I am now required to reconsider in light of new evidence. That reconsideration will take place in conversation with the Millhaven Court, not in this clearing, and not on the basis of your opinion of what the journal may or may not be." He turned to Clara and held the documents out to her. "I'll be returning these to you, Mrs. Thorne. I would strongly advise keeping them somewhere secure." She took them. Her fingers closed over the journal, and she held it against her chest for a moment, the old familiar weight of it, and then she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not relief exactly, but release, the specific sensation of a thing that has been pressed against you for so long that you had forgotten it was there until it was removed, and the absence of it was its own kind of knowledge. Pastor Greaves stepped forward. He had been silent for a long time, and the silence had cost him something. She could see it in his face, in the particular discomfort of a man who had arrived with moral certainty and found the ground shifting. "Mrs. Thorne," he began in the voice he used for difficult pastoral moments, "the church extends its—" "No," she said. He stopped. "Not today," she said. It was not angry. It was not unkind. It was simply final, the way certain doors were final when they closed, not slammed, but shut with the quiet, complete authority of someone who has decided what is on which side of them. "Your comfort with me and your discomfort with me are your concerns, Pastor, not mine." Greaves closed his mouth. He looked, she thought, almost relieved, as though the refusal had spared him from having to find words adequate to what the morning had revealed. Mayor Burke made one more attempt. He gathered what remained of his civic authority, which was not much, and directed it at Silas. Thorne. Whatever this woman has shown us today, the fact remains that your household has been a source of disruption and controversy in this community. The town has a right to— Burke, Silas said. Burke stopped. The town's right, Silas said, ends at my fence line. He looked at the assembled men, all of them one by one, with the unhurried and specific attention of someone who wanted to be certain he was understood clearly. You are welcome to leave now. It was not a threat. It was not accompanied by any raising of the rifle or elevation of voice. It was simply the statement of a man who owned the ground he stood on in every sense the word ownership could carry, by deed, by work, by choice, by the long years of his inconvenient integrity, and who had no remaining interest in negotiating its terms with people who had never dealt with him fairly. Calvin Dreer mounted his horse first. He looked at Clara as he settled into the saddle, a long, considering look that contained something she had not expected from him, a muted acknowledgment, the look of a professional who had been handed a different truth than the one he came with and was honest enough to receive it. He turned his horse toward the track and rode out of the clearing without looking back. The others followed in the disorganized, slightly sheepish way of people who had arrived with collective momentum and were now departing without it, each one reclaiming the private distance of a man who had not personally been the one to make the decisions that led to this. The councilmen went without speaking. Two of the men on foot went around the side of the cabin to avoid crossing directly in front of the porch. Burke went last, pulling his gray horse around with the controlled irritation of a man who intended to find a way to be right about this later in a different context in front of a different audience, as men like Burke always did. Then they were gone. The track through the birches was empty. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the ordinary sounds of the March morning, the creek, the wind returning now that it had somewhere to go. Again, the woodpecker resuming its patient work in its chosen tree. Clara stood in the middle of the clearing. She did not move for a long moment. She was aware of the ground under her feet, the frozen earth that was beginning just barely at the surface to soften in the pale spring sun. She was aware of the space that had been occupied by 8 men and their horses, and all the weight of official judgment and communal disapproval, which was now simply space clear and cold and hers. She was aware of Silas coming down from the porch, his footsteps on the frozen ground, coming to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He was very good at not saying anything when silence was the right choice, and it was the right choice now, because there were no words adequate to the sum of what the morning had been, and she did not need words from him. She needed exactly what he offered, his presence solid and unhurried, and entirely without demand beside her in the empty clearing. She looked at the journal in her hands. 4 years and 9 days. She thought about the girl from Indiana who had believed in the edge of the world until she was 7 years old. She thought about her mother saying some lies are worth telling because they make the winter shorter. She thought about the woman who had stood at the window of a Millhaven house she was not allowed to leave, and had understood finally that survival required movement, even movement without destination, even the terrifying open road of not knowing what came next. She thought about the stagecoach and the gray sky over Ashwood Ridge, and the torn contract in the town square, and the cold, specific humiliation of being named in public by someone who did not know her. She thought about Silas Thorne walking through a crowd of sneering faces to say something quietly true to a stranger. She thought about the axe handle sanded smooth. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that reading expression. The one she had come to understand was not an intrusion, but an attention, a person genuinely interested in what she was, as opposed to what she could be made into. "It's over," she said. She meant many things by it. She trusted that he understood most of them. For now, he said, which was honest and therefore more comforting than a simpler assurance would have been. She almost smiled. For now, she agreed. She looked down at the journal one more time. Then she went to the workshop. Silas followed not because she had asked him to, but because they had become over the winter the kind of people who moved toward the same place without having to coordinate the decision. She set the journal on his workbench among the tools and the wood shavings and the clean smell of honest work, and she looked at it for a moment. "I want to put this somewhere," she said. "Somewhere it exists as a record, not hidden, not carried, just existing." He thought about this. He went to the low cabinet where he kept his documentation, the careful files of a man who had learned the hard way that records mattered, contracts and paid invoices, and the meticulous notes of a person who had once trusted that truth was self-evident and had since come to understand that truth needed witnesses. He opened the cabinet and made a space on the shelf, a deliberate space between his own documents, and he looked at her. She put the journal there. She put Dr. Heller's report beside it. She closed the cabinet. The workbench was between them, scattered with the morning's abandoned work. The long piece of oak still clamped the plane where he had set it when she had come to tell him there was a bounty hunter in the yard. He picked the plane up and turned it in his hands, and she watched the familiar ease with which he held it, the tool that was an extension of him, the instrument of the work that was his language. "The oak," she said. "What is it for?" "Window frame," he said. "New window." He paused. "South wall. Gets more light." She looked at the south wall of the workshop, which was currently solid log, and she understood that the window was not only a window, that it was the declaration of a man who intended to be in this place for a long time and wanted more light in it. "It will be warm in the afternoons," she said. "That's the idea," he said. She went back outside. The clearing was fully empty now, the only evidence of the morning's confrontation, the churned mud where the horses had stood, which the ground was already beginning to reclaim in its unhurried, implacable way. She walked to the garden. She knelt at the edge of the first bed and pressed her fingers into the soil, testing it the way she had been testing it every few days for a week, waiting for the moment when the freeze had gone deep enough below the surface to allow the first real planting. The soil gave under her fingers, not much, but enough the first real softness of the season. She sat back on her heels and looked at the garden, and at the tree line, and at the cabin, with its sensible, plain face, and at the workshop where she could hear the plane beginning its work on the oak again. The long, smooth stroke of a blade along a board, the sound of something being made ready. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling at the edge of the garden bed with her hands in the soil, and she allowed herself to feel the fullness of what the winter had given her. Not what it had taken, she had accounts for that, and would not minimize them, but what it had given. The cabin, the sparrow on the ledge, the hand on the table, the man who had stood in front of an angry crowd and refused to step aside, not because he was certain she was innocent in the way that required evidence, but because he was certain she was good in the way that required knowing, and he had known her. She was not the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach into a gray November. That woman had been intact, had maintained her posture and her composure and her dignity through tremendous daily effort, but she had been carrying everything alone for so long that she had forgotten that aloneness was a condition rather than a law. She had forgotten that it was possible to be known. She had stopped wanting it because wanting things you cannot have is its own kind of pain. She knew the cost of opening. She had paid it before with Robert Voss, and the price had been 3 years and a stained journal and a flight in the dark. She was not naive about what love could cost a person. But she also knew now, with the particular knowledge, that only survived experience could give what the absence of it cost. 4 years and 9 days. The weight of a thing carried alone until you could no longer remember what it felt like not to carry it. She heard the workshop door. She heard his footsteps on the frozen ground, the familiar unhurried cadence of a man who moved through the world at his own pace and had made his peace with that. She did not turn around. She heard him stop at the edge of the garden. "The seeds came," he said. "The order from the catalog. Picked it up this morning before they arrived." A pause. Left it on the table. She had not seen the package on the table. She had not had the chance. She looked at the empty beds, all the dark, ready earth, and she thought about what she had planned for them over the winter. The careful layout of a garden that would take the full season to realize that would not be complete until the summer, that required a person to be present for the length of a growing season and to intend to still be present at the harvest. She stood. She turned to face him. He was holding something. She had not seen him go into the workshop, for it had not heard him pick it up, but there it was in his hand, small and unmistakable, the carved wooden sparrow from the window ledge. He held it out to her. She looked at it in his palm, the small lifted wings, the posture of a bird that had decided to go somewhere and then committed to the decision. "I made it in November," he said, "the first week you were here." He looked at the sparrow, then at her with the direct, undeflecting honesty that was the essential nature of the man. "I wanted you to have something that said you can stay, without having to say it with words, because I wasn't sure then how words would land." He paused. "I'm sure now." She took the sparrow from his open hand. Its carved weight was familiar against her fingers. All the mornings she had touched it on the ledge, all the light it had caught, all the shadow it had thrown on the wood beside it. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and then she looked at him, at the angular, tired, honest face of a man who had given her a home when she had none, and a name when hers had been made a weapon, and his floor when she had needed to be safe, and who had stood in front of everything the world sent against her with the simple, immovable fact of who he was. She closed her fingers around the sparrow. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the clearing in the March light, with the creek running its snowmelt in the near distance, and the birches at the tree line making their second attempt at spring leaves, pale and tentative, and absolutely committed. And neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said. After a while, she lifted her face from his shoulder and looked past him toward the porch. The cabin door was open as they had left it in the urgency of the morning, and through it she could see the interior, the table, the stove, the shelf with its ordered provisions, the window where the sparrow had sat in its particular light all winter, now empty and waiting, and it looked like what it was. Hers, not in the way of possession or transaction, in the way of belonging, in the way that certain things, chosen and kept through difficulty, become the truest version of themselves. She did not run. She had been running for 4 years and 9 days, and she was done running. She walked back up the porch steps and through the open door and into the warm interior of her own home, and she set the sparrow back on the window ledge where the afternoon light would find it, and she picked up the package of seeds from the table where he had left it, and she began to read the labels. He came in behind her. He went to the workshop door and picked up the clamped piece of oak and brought it inside and set it near the south wall, measuring the space for the window he intended to put there, the window that would let in more light. They worked in companionable quiet, she with the seeds and he with the wood in the cabin that was theirs in the cold and clarifying light of a March morning in a country that was hard and indifferent and beautiful, and outside, the birches were trying again with their pale new leaves. And near the porch steps, barely visible through the remnant snow, small and green and entirely serious about existing, the first wildflowers of the season were coming up through the frozen ground, not asking permission, not waiting for the weather to be kind, simply rising because rising was what they did, because the season had turned, and the ground was ready, and they had waited long enough.